Boker Tov, we're up to Daf Gimel. The Gemara on the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Beis had established that there was a chazaka that's called Stam Safri D'Dainim Migmar Gmiri, and therefore on a Torah level we can rely on the Sofrim that Rov Bekiyin B'Lishma. Most cases they know Lishma even in Chutz La'aretz. So technically, according to the Din Doraisa Mikar Din, the get is kosher. And that's true even according to Rabbi Meir, who, as a general rule throughout Shas, is Choshesh L'mi Uta. So therefore, the entire requirement of B'fanei Nechtam is the Takana D'Rabbanan. And on a Doraisa level, we're not Choshesh that the get was not written Lishma. And when the Rabbanan made this Gzeira, this Takana, to require the Eidus on the Lishma, because maybe the Baal will claim, somebody found a get and whatever, it wasn't written Lishma, etc. And therefore, we can rely on the Eidus of one Eid, despite the general rule of Ein Davar Shebe'erva Pachos Mishnayim. And Vahacha Mishum Eguna Akilu Be'Rabbana. The Gemara on the top of Daf Gimel establishes that if, for example, we will need two Eidim in a case where we have reason to be Choshesh, and then she is left with this get, she'll be an aguna for all her days. So the Rabbanu would make il, and they said, you know what, we're going to rely on the aidus of one aid, of the shliach himself, who brings the get, and testifies b'fanei nechtam. The principle of the Gemara here is that this is a kula that we will not require two aidim in a case where she might not be able to find two aidim, but rather will rely on the testimony of one aid, namely the shliach. So the Gemara asks the following question: Hi kula, who is this really a takana lekula by relying on the shliach to testify that the get is a kosher get? It was written lishma chumrahu. I'm going to prove to you logically that through this takana, you're adding a chumrah to her. Di mitzrachas leitrei. If the Rabbana would have said, you know what, let's require two Eidim, and they will testify that the get was written Lishma, then lo asi Baal ma'ara, the Baal would never come along and question the validity of the get upasale and disqualify the get. The Baal would not be believed against the testimony of two Eidim. But now that you made a takana to rely on the shliach, well, wait a second, the shliach is only chad, he's only one witness. And Eidach Bakchasha Lav Klumu. We have a principle that if there's another person who contradicts the testimony of one aid, then we throw out the aidus of the aid. Asi Baal Ma'aru Pasalet. The Baal is going to come forward and he's going to claim that the get is not kosher. And then the shliach, who's one aid, is contradicting him and saying the get is kosher. Then in such a case, one aid against another aid, we have to get rid of the aidus. So the Chachamim, by making this takana, that instead of requiring two aid and we're going to rely on one aid, they're really not being lenient, and it's not a kula on behalf of the Isha, because at the end of the day, that aidus might not be meaningful because of the ira Baal. When the Baal questions or contests the kashus of the get, it's his word against the word of the shliach. So therefore, it would make more sense, according to the Makshan here, that the Chachamim would make a takana to require two eidim. So then the Baal could not possibly cast any sort of suspicion about the validity of the get because he's contradicted by two eidim. So the Gemara says, "Kevan the Omar Mar." This is a sugya later on in Daf Hey. If they come and noslo, we're going to have machlokes between two Amoraim, Rav Yochanan and Rav Chanina, about the case of a shliach who brought a get from Chutz La'aretz. How many people have to be present at the time that he gives the get to his wife? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina. Chad Amar, according to one opinion, the shliach has to give the get b'fnei shnayim, in the presence of two witnesses. The Chad Amar, according to the other opinion, the shliach has to pass on the get b'fnei shlosha, in the presence of three witnesses. So in the case of what we call Mesiras HaGet, when the shliach actually gives the get into the hands of the Isha, and he brought the get from Medina Sayyam, everybody agrees that the minimum amount of witnesses that have to be there at the time of the Mesiras HaGet is Shnayim, two witnesses. And therefore, Meikara, from the beginning, when the shliach brings the get, after he receives it from the hands of the Baal, then Medik Dayak, he's certainly going to be absolutely certain and check beyond any shadow of a doubt, clarify with certainty that the Baal is giving him the get because he wants to divorce his wife. And therefore, he's not going to change his mind, the Baal, in the future and come and contest the get. Now, this lo asi l'rei nafshe is a general rule that we find in Shas, that we don't believe that a person would jeopardize their own reputation. And based on that circumstantial evidence, or shall we say that umdana, a logical assumption of that part, we believe someone and we give him credibility in an absolute way. He would never put into question his whole reputation, his whole credibility in the future. For example, we have a precedent from this in the Gemara in Chulin with regard to a chef who testifies that he tasted the food and there's no taste of milk in the meat, and he's not reliable per se. But because Chazaka Urelo Mari Nafshayu, he would not get himself into a situation where they catch him on a fabrication and he'll lose his entire reputation. He might even lose his job. So that's called Lomari Nafshayu. And therefore, if the Baal comes later on and claims that I didn't have any interest, I was very happily married, I never wanted to divorce my wife, then even though the shliach who contradicts him is one single witness, and we would have said one view, one testimony against another, there's a head-on collision, and we don't know who to believe. Chad keneged chad. But here in this case, we believe the shliach because he's definitely going to be very, very careful and guarantee that the Baal gave him the get and commissioned him to bring the get to his wife, because the Baal had come to an absolute decision that he wants to divorce his wife. So therefore, if the Baal comes forward and he contests the validity of the get with an error, we don't believe him. We believe the shliach who has this chazaka that he's very medayik b'dvara. And you may recall that in the Gemara in Yevamis, in the parak called Ha'isha Rabbah, we had the same svara, that if one aide comes to testify that her husband died and he saw her husband dead, we're going to allow her to get remarried, even though we need two witnesses, but there's a chazaka that isha daiku mitzvah. She realizes the long-range repercussions, almost catastrophic repercussions, of her husband coming back alive after she married some other man. And therefore, we give her that nemanus called daika umitzvah, medayik, and she gets married. She'll check, she'll use every detective agency in the world until she's clarified beyond any shadow of a doubt that her husband is dead. And here too, the shliach is medayek, medik dayek, meikara. His nemonis is dependent upon the fact that he knows and he's certain that he was appointed as a shliach by the Baal when the Baal gave him the get to give to his wife, because the Baal came to an absolute decision that he wants to divorce his wife. And based on that, medik dayek, the Chachamim say will believe the shliach to say b'fanei nechtam. And not only that, if the Baal comes to be ma'ara, we're not going to believe the Baal, his word against the word of the shliach. Now, all this is the sugya of Rava, who says that the takana of our Mishnah of the Fanei Nechtam is because of Lishma. What about Rava? Rava's takana was made because of Shayaras Mitzuyos, ain't Shayaras Mitzuyos. And we're worried about Kiyum Ashtar. Now, the halach of Kiyum Ashtar is formulated by the Mishnah in Masechet Ksubas, and there the Mishnah establishes that in order to be Mekayim Ashtar and authenticated, so that we know for sure there was no forgery in the writing of the shtar, we need two witnesses. So the Gemara right now asks, if Rav is worried about the fact that if there's a claim that these signatures are not authentic, but rather they were forged, then you need Kiyum Shtar. And Rav is worried about the fact that who's going to be Mekayim Shtar when there's so few shayoros coming from Medina Sayyam. So Gemara says, Liboy Trey, then according to Rava, the logic should command us to require two witnesses who bring the get. And they will testify on the signatures on the get. We know that these signatures are valid, are authentic. Let's take a look at the general halach of shtaros. In order to be Mekayim Shtar, we require two witnesses. And at this point in the sugya, we're going to get into the question of whether or not this requirement of Kiyum Shtar is Doraisa or D'Rabbanan. And we will activate the principle of Reish Lakish that Eidem Achsum al Shtar Nas Kamishan Echka Idusam Bebezdin, and therefore we don't need, according to the Torah law, to be Mekayim and verify the signatures on the shtar. So the Gemara says the following, that I can answer your question and differentiate between Kiyum Get, and that's Eidus not on Mammon, but rather on Isurim, and therefore we apply the principle of Erechanem Bisurin as opposed to a shtar in Dini Momenos, where the Torah says Al Pishnayim Eidim Yokum Dova. So the Gemara again argues, and we've seen this in the past, there's no chezkas iser. We cannot identify this piece, and the Eid Echad is going to identify it for us. We don't have a chazaka that this is definitely chelev. There was never one moment in time where we knew that it was chelev. As far as we're concerned, maybe it's Shuman, 50-50. And therefore, Eid Echad is Nemon in a situation where he's not contradicting and he's not uprooting a chezkas iser. But here in Hilchas Isurim, she has a very strong chazak. We know that until the get is given and validated, she's an Eishes Ish. So you want to be motzi, you want to take the woman out of her chazaka and say now, instead of being a surah, b'toras Eishes Ish, she's muteres. Well, guess what? For that, you can't rely on the testimony of Eid Echad. And then the Gemara adds another point here. And that is, you want to be mater and isha l'shuk, havi davar be'erva, v'ein davar be'erva, pachs mishnayim. The Torah says, with regard to davar erva, and here we have a gzeira shava of equating dini momenos and dini arayos, that just like in dini momenos, the Torah requires two edim, al pishnayim edim yakum davar, is davar mimama. Kiyim tzaba eshes davar, ervas davar. In the parsha of Arayos, it says Davar, and in the parsha of Edus in Dini Mominus, it says Davar. And Yalfin in Davar Mama, that in Arayos and Davar Shvever, we need two Edin. So how can you tell me that when one witness, in this case the Shliach, testifies that B'fani Nechtam, on the basis of that credibility of one aid, we're going to be matter, we're going to allow and give a license to get married? How is that possible? It's an aid echad who's undermining and contradicting a cheskas isu. So the Gemara answers, "Bedinu to be kiyum shtaris nami lo liboitre." We really don't require two witnesses for kiyum shtaris according to the Doraisa. Why? The Torah relies on a shtar when there are two signatures, and the assumption is that these signatures are valid, they're authentic. Elamat, Rabbanan hu diatzrich kiyum. Rabbanan required kiyum ashtar. Maybe because in the passage of time there was an increase in the number of forgeries out there in the street. So they required kiyum ashtar. That was a rabbinic requirement. It was established and enacted by the Rabbanan. So basically on a deraisa level, if a person's holding on to a shtar and the shtar testifies on their behalf and there are two signatures on the shtar is valid. The Torah relies on the kenechkara. Kenechkara means it's as if the Eidei Ashtar, that's the power of a shtar, were interrogated in Beis Din. They passed all the interrogations. Yesterday, when we started the Masechet, I gave an example of a Tudat Hechsher, that any question that you raise on the kashrus of this enterprise, you'll always be machriya that it's kosher. And so too, if you have any doubt as to whether the two witnesses who are signed on the shtar, these are authentic signatures, then the shtar itself is kenechkara. It paskins lehechsher in any question, any possible issue that would arise on the shtar. The Rabbanan said, nevertheless, out there in the reality, there's a lot of forgery going on. We're going to require two witnesses to validate the shtar. That's in shar shtaros. However, here, when we're talking about a get that's being brought by a shliach from Medina Sayam, Mishumi Guna, a kilu Rabbanan, the Rabbanan now decide that we're going to be making. We're not going to go back to the Doraisa Halacha Reish Lakish. We're not going to assume up front that the two Eidim whose signatures appear on the shtar actually signed on the shtar. We can be absolutely definite. We'll need, however, the witness, the single witness, the shliach's testimony, and that's going to be reliable. And perhaps the Gemara at this point is operating with the daika that we spoke about, Medik Dayik, and there's a special nemanis to the shliach, but I don't even know if we need that. And this is, again, the power of Mishumi Guna Hikilu Rabbanan. That in the area of Edus, we find over and over again that in order to prevent a woman from becoming an Aguna, such that she's locked up in this marriage for life and she can never get married, the Rabbanan will change the requirements of Edus, but again, only within the purview of the Doraisa. So since Midoraisa, the shtar is Kenechgara, we want to be choshish and require edus. Now we're going to lower the standards and the requirements of edus with regard to b'fanei nechtam of the shliach because of the ego. The Gemara says, "Hi, Kulahu, are you really operating on behalf of this woman for her best interest to make it lenient for her and easier for her?" Chumrahu. Why? If we would have required two witnesses to bring the get. The Baal is not going to come and contest the validity of the get and say, well, these two signatures are forged signatures. He's not going to possibly get because it's Chad Keneged Trey. It's his word against two Eidim. But now you lowered the standard and you've opened up a Pandora's box for the Baal to come and be ma'ar on the get. Why? Because Chad, if you're relying on the testimony of one shliach, Asi Baal ma'ar v'apostle, it'd be his word against his word. And once again, the Gemara is going to need to introduce this Medik Daik. So Gemara says the following: came on the Omar again, as sugi later on in Daf Hey bifnei kamen osin lo Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Chanina chadam bifnei shnayim chadam bifnei shlosha. Is meikara medik dayik, since he's going to have to give over the get to shliach in the presence of minimum of 2 eidim according to everybody, then he'll certainly be medagdek livdok ulevar shabal nosin lo a get mitok rotzon legarsh. That the Baal has come to an absolute decision, 100% without any reservations, to divorce his wife. And the shliach would not play games because he doesn't want to lose his credibility, his reputation to be Naaman. And not only that, you could add here, but please don't quote me on this, that some of these shluchim were actually hired and paid workers. That's how they made a living. So he wants to know that in the future, the shliach I'm talking about, right, wants to know that in the future he will be appointed as a shliach. And if the Baal is going to come and say this whole thing is a forgery, the shliach really looks bad. And who's going to believe the shliach in the future? So therefore, there's such a strong credibility here based on the Medik Dayak Svara that we will not believe the era of the Baal when we pit his word against the word of the Shliach. Now the Gemara goes back to the original machlokas, the issue that divides Rabbah and Rava. Rabbah again said that Takon is based on the chashash that maybe they don't know about Lishma. Eina b'kiyah b'Lishma. And Rava said, no, the chash is maybe there'll be some question about the signatures on the get, and how are we going to bring over 2 witnesses from Chutz La'aretz, from Medina Sayyam, to be Mekayim the Shtar when it's Ein Shayoros Mitzvah. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Isn't Rabbah's principle so fundamental, and the entire entity of the get in every situation is dependent upon Lishma? Wouldn't Rava be satisfied with the logic of Rabbah? So the Gemara says, "For Rava, my time aloma karabah milcha mik tani b'fani nechtav lishma b'fani nechtav lishma." The nusach of the Mishnah should have been absolutely clear by adding the word lishma, both in terms of the ksiva and the chsima, to indicate that the reason for this takana and the background for the takana is a chash that it wasn't written lishma. And really, this is a major question for Rabbah, because if Rabbah is correct and the clarification of the shliach is necessary because of the din of lishma, why wasn't that mentioned in terms of the words that come out of the mouth of the shliach? The shliach has to come in front of Bezdin. So what's he going to say? That doesn't solve your problem. Okay, fine. You saw the writing of the get. You witnessed the signatures, the signing of the get. But how do we know it was lishma? So in the mouth of the shliach, when he testifies in front of Bezdin, bringing the shtar, the get, in his hand, he should be testifying b'fanai nechtam lishma, b'fanai nechtam lishma. So Rav is going to say b'dinu de lisnei hachit. You're right. There's a very strong argument, because there's no question that the shliach has to mention that he knows that the get was written and signed lishma. Ella, but the Chachamim didn't make a takana to add the word lishma. Why? De'i mafshata le dibura asi lemigzere. If we're going to require that the shliach add words, that's called mifshat le dibura. We're going to add a ribui to the requirement of the statement of the shliach, that when he gives the get, he has to say, well, I know it was written lishma, I know it was signed lishma. Then asay lemigzeret. You know what? Maybe he'll leave something out of the nusach that the Rabbanan were misaken that the shliach has to recite. And the reason for that is, like for example, again, it's not a good beispiel, but if a man is Masada Kedushin, as the Rav, he'll say to the Chassan, say after me, Hare, At, Mikudeshes, Li, etc., etc. In other words, the Nusach, if it's too heavy and too long, we're afraid that people might not be able to live up to those standards and those requirements. And if the Shliach, doesn't speak out the entire Nusach HaMoleh that the Chacham established, then we have a principle called Mishana Mimatbeh Shetovu Chacham Begittin Yotzi Vavlad Mamzer. And this is a sugya later on in Daf Hayamid Beis. And it's Machlok Shin Rabbi Meir, and Rabbanan Meir says the Vlad is a Mamzer. And the Rabbanan say that she can't get remarried. But if she does get married, the child is not a Mamzer. This is a sugya of Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim later on. But be that as it may, we have to be worried about a long nusach that's too complicated, because then we get into the problem of Hamashana Mimatbeya in event that he didn't recite the entire nusach. I wasn't sure why they couldn't give it to him written out on a piece of paper, let him read it from a piece of paper. So that's a sugya ksubis about edus, that edim have to be able to answer the questions and the interrogations without looking at something that they wrote. Okay, I don't know. That's an issue. So now the Rabbanan are misaken that when the shliach recites his nusach, it should be an abridged nusach. It should be as short and concise as possible. So we don't have to worry that he might leave out something from the nusach. And therefore, the Gemara is maintaining now that even though the shliach is not going to say explicitly, "B'fanai nechtav get zel l'shma," "B'fanai nechtam get zel l'shma," he's only going to say "B'fanai nechtam," and nevertheless, we're going to rely on that amira as if he had added the word l'shma. So the Gemara says, "Hashtanami," I don't understand. Asi lemixere. Even now that the Rabbanan were masakin, they established a very abridged nusach amira without adding the word l'shma twice. Still, we have to worry about the possibility that the shliach might leave something out, and he might be mishanim imatbea shetovu chacham v'gittin. So therefore, the whole enterprise of establishing a takana like this that requires a nusach that has to be enunciated verbally by the shliach, that takana is not a good idea, because you're always running into the problem of maybe that he'll be mishana miloshen chachamim and he'll possibly get. So the Gemara says the following: we don't have to be choshesh that the shliach is going to omit any words, because chanami tlos goyes, chanami tarti lo goyes. If you have 3 words, that's already room for a chashash that maybe he'll leave out a word. So, for example, if the takana would have been b'fonai nechtav l'shma, which is 3 words, then the shliach might leave out a word. But chanami tarti, if all you're going to require is 2 words b'fonai nechtav, lo goyes, we're not suspicious. We don't have to worry about the fact that he might omit something from a 2-word nusach. And therefore they were misaken b'fonai nes, that the shliach say b'fonai nechtav, and then Achoshesh say he's going to leave out a word. He's just saying 2 words. And he won't be mishanim matbeh shetovu chachamim. And even with regard to the nusach regarding the chasima l'shma, all we're asking him is to say b'fonai nechtav. And b'fonai nechtav is a separate formula, a separate nusach, and again, it's made up of 2 words. So now the Gemara wants to switch it around. You know what? Rav has a very solid argument. She's going to be stuck if there's any question about the authenticity of the signatures. Without Kiyum, she doesn't have a possibility of importing Eidim to be Mekayim the stars. Rabba, my time Rabba. This is what Rabba would argue. In Cain, if Rav is correct, Nisnei, the Mishnah should have said in the formula of the Shliach, B'fanai nechtam, and that's it. Nothing more. B'sulo. Well, why is he talking about the ksiva? Why are we requiring through this takana that the Shliach has to mention the writing of the get? What are we talking about? We're only talking about the issue of establishing the veracity of the chesimos, because if you're going to require kiyum haget, it's very complicated in shayos mitzuyos. Is b'fanei nechtav lamali? Why is he required, the shliach required, to testify about the ksiva? Shma mino binin l'shma. The only problem that could arise vis-a-vis the ksiva, if the shliach doesn't solve this problem, is l'shma, that maybe the ksiva was not done l'shma. Again, it seems that Rabbah is not satisfied or not comfortable with the concept of Safra de Daini, that there's a certain bekiyus that we can rely on in the Safra de Daini, because Rabbah was of the opinion that in Chutz La'aretz they weren't so knowledgeable about the requirement of Lishma. Now, in the Gemara that we're looking at now, there seems to be, which is going to come up later on, that Rabbah agrees to Rava, meaning that Rabbah is also worried about the chasima, because the takana was b'fanei nechtam, but Rava is got a problem, because why b'fanei nechtam? And the Gemara says, for Rava would say that b'dinu the lisnei hachi, it really should have said that the shliach only has to say b'fanei nechtam. So why did the Mishnah add b'fanei nechtav? Ella di'imkein asilach lufe b'kiyim shtars di'alm. If the shliach would not also add a statement about the ksiva, then people would think that you could create a kiyum ashtar with the testimony of one witness, namely the shliach. Now that's true with regard to a get. It's not true with regard to other shtaros. And b'yed echad, they're going to think that, you know what, for other shtaros, all we need in order to authenticate the signature on the shtar is one witness. But if we are mesaken to require that the shliach recite not only b'fanei nechtam, but also b'fanei nechtav, then it's clear to everyone that this is a special takana, mishum iguna, as we said before, that we rely on the testimony of one aid, where for kiyum shtaros bi'alma we would require no less than two aid. And now the Gemara is going to show us why Rabbah objected to Rava and would not accept this principle that they added b'fanei nechtav in order to avoid a mistake on the part of the spectator regarding kiyum shtaros di'alma. Midami. So the Rabbah midami, Rabbah is going to argue that kiyum shtaros is not similar to kiyum haget. No one's going to come to any conclusions based on kiyum haget with regard to kiyum shtaros to make that analogy and think that, you know what, eid echad is enough in get, and if eid echad is enough to kiyum shtaros di'alma. And now Rabbah is going to enumerate no less than 3 differences between kiyum shtaros and kiyum haget. Number 1, hasam, in the case of kiyum shtaros, the statement of the witnesses is yadi'inan. We recognize the signatures on the shtar, but hacha, in the case of the shliach, he's not saying yadi'inan or yodeani, but rather b'fanai. Look at the nusa. He's not saying yodeani, that these 2 chasimos are authentic, but rather he's saying b'fanai, that I saw the chasima of the shtar, or the get. And if he doesn't say that, if he doesn't add the word b'fanai, then we throw him out of court. He has not fulfilled that basic requirement that the Chacham established of Fanei Nechtam. So there's a clear-cut difference here between Kiyum Shtaros, where all that has to be said is, I recognize Yadi'inon, we recognize these two Chasimas. And there's no requirement of Bufanai. The Eidei Kiyum don't have to testify that they saw the Chasima. They were there and present at the time that these two Eidim signed on the Shtar. No requirement to that. So the word Bufanai in Shar Shtar's Kiyum B'Alma would be totally out of place. So therefore, we're not going to require Bufanai Nechtam or Bufanai Nechtam in Shar Shtaros, and the spectator seeing that in Get we require Bufanai Nechtam, he obviously concludes that this is a separate halacha in Get. Now there's a second distinction. Hasam in Kiyum Shtaros B'Alma Isha Lo Mehemna. A woman is not believed according to the laws of Edus. She's Psula Edus, and she can't testify in front of a bezdin that we know that these two signatures on the shtar are authentic. But Hacha Isha Mehemna. Here, if a woman brings a get for her female colleague, I guess you could call it, then when she says Fanei Nechtam, she's believed. No one's going to draw conclusions from get to Shtaros B'Alma to allow a woman to be Makayim a get. A shtar. And Rabbah is consistently saying here that it's going to be clear to the spectator, to the Velt, that these are separate halachas, unique halachas in get. This is not Kiyum Shtaros. Kiyum Shtaros, by definition, requires that we have testimony on Yediyah, not on Bifanai. And Kiyum Shtaros B'Alma requires men and not women. And finally, the third distinction is that Hasam Baldover Lo Mehemnin V'Hacha Baldover Mehemnin. In this case, the Baal Ashtar, for example, let's say you borrowed 1,000 from me, and I'm holding on to this shtar to testify to that effect. I'm not believed to testify about the shtar that I'm holding on to. Obviously, I have vested interests in validating the shtar so I can collect my 1,000 from you. But in this case, who is testifying about the get? It's the shliach himself. Now, who is this baldover that the Gemara says Meheman is believed? It's not clear. I thought initially, intuitively, that we're talking about the shliach. But when you think about it, the shliach is not a baldover per se. This get is not relevant to him. So the answer is that there is one case where the shliach is a baldover. And that's the case where a woman brings her own get from Medina Sayyam. She's the shliach, so to speak. Well, I wouldn't call her a shliach exactly, but in any event, she's going to come into a bezdin here in Eretz Yisrael, and she's going to be believed to say B'fanei Nechtam. And yet she's a baldova, because based on her testimony, we're going to allow her to get married. How can we rely on her? The answer is that this is the special halacha of a shliach for get, and no one's going to draw any conclusions and analogies to Kiyum Shtaros B'Alma. So the Masechet here offers a summary of everything that Rabbah argued. He says, "Harei sheyesh kama chilukim yiduim." There are some well-known distinctions here between Kiyum Shtaros to Amiris B'fanei Nechtam. V'ein lachshol shema yitu l'kayim shtoros al pi eid echad k'mo beget. And therefore, chazra hochacha kedas Rabbah, that since the Mishnah requires b'fanei nechtav, it must be that we're worried about lishma. And it's not just kiyum get, because if it was kiyum get, all we would require would be b'fanei nechtam. We would not require b'fanei nechtam. But Rav Amelcha. So what counter argument would Rav offer? So you know what? I'm still worried about mistake, even despite all these fancy esoteric distinctions that you've made. Ota acha ki amri yad'inan milo mehemin. Let's say the shliach brings the get, and let's say there was more than one shliach, okay, at least in general, right? And they bring the get and they say, you know what? We know and we recognize the chasimas eidei get. That's fine. They don't have to, the shliach doesn't have to say b'fanai nechtam, the magic word that he was there at the time of the chasima. So therefore, if he uses the word yad'inan, or yad'i, right? I know, instead of using the word b'fanai, then came the chi'amri yadina mehem the asil chuvikim shtos bi'alma b'yedecha. So according to Rava, there's no absolute gzeres hakasuv that the shliach must recite those magic words b'fanai, and we would rely on him if he says yadina. No, okay, if he's saying yadina, then it's very similar to kiyum shtos bi'alma. And people, once again, insist Rava are going to make the mistake, and they're going to think that in Kiyum Shtaros Bi'alma, 1/8 is sufficient. Now, Ula Rabba, the Gemara asks the Amar Lefisha Ein B'Kiyum B'Lishma Man Haitana D'Boy Lishma Uboy Hasima Lishma. Okay, now we get into the gigantic machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar. And this machlokes, which is called Eidi Ksiva, Karse, Eidi Masira, Karse, and so forth, revolves on the question of whether or not the requirement of Eidus is in the Masira Saget or in the Siva Saget, or let's call it Chasima Saget. And the Gemara now wants to know, according to which of these two Tanoim to require Ksiva Lishma to justify Rabbah's understanding of the Takana of B'fanei Nechta.